My mother didn't lower her voice when she said it. She didn't wait until my 8-year-old daughter was out of the room, and she didn't even put down her fork. She just pointed toward the hallway while everyone was halfway through Thanksgiving dinner and said, "Isabella, your cousin gets that room now. You can sleep downstairs." My daughter stopped chewing. Across the table, my sister Kayla stared at her plate. My father suddenly became very interested in carving another slice of turkey. Nancy, my mother, went right on eating as if she had just told Isabella where the extra napkins were. I looked at Isabella first. That mattered more than whatever argument my mother was expecting from me. Her face had gone completely still, the way children sometimes look when they're trying to figure out whether an adult is joking. "My room?" she asked. Nancy gave her a patient smile that somehow made the whole thing worse. "You hardly use it, sweetheart. Peyton needs it more. You can use the downstairs room when you visit." Peyton, my 9-year-old niece, looked almost as uncomfortable as Isabella. Nobody had asked her to speak, and she didn't look happy about winning anything. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I reached for my phone, opened the business banking app connected to my family's company, and changed one thing. 10 minutes later, my mother's phone buzzed beside her plate. She looked down at the screen, and the fork slipped from her fingers hard enough to strike the china. "What did you do?" she demanded. That was the moment I realized the bedroom wasn't the real surprise waiting for me that Thanksgiving. If you're doing well today, stay with me, because what I found after that dinner changed the way I looked at my mother, my sister, and the company I had spent years helping build. And if stories about family betrayal, hard boundaries, and consequences are your kind of story, subscribe to the channel and keep listening, because the room was only the beginning. I pushed my chair back and touched Isabella lightly on the shoulder. "Come upstairs with me." Nancy immediately sighed. "Sarah, don't make this dramatic." I ignored her. If I had learned anything by 37, it was that people who made cruel decisions loved accusing everyone else of creating drama when those decisions finally got noticed. Ryan, my husband, started to stand, but I shook my head once. I wanted a minute alone with Isabella before anybody began explaining to her why she was supposedly unreasonable for being hurt. The upstairs bedroom had never legally belonged to Isabella,
Charleston
and I wasn't
Jewelers
going
just
to
read
pretend
Elizabeth's
otherwise.
draft.
It was my
And she
parents'
was
house.
15 years
Paragraph
old.
of the
The
almost
strongest
4
writing
years
she
in
had
our
worn that
family. Nancy
ring
had
every
called it
day. Juliet
Isabella
has
her adult
nothing
life.
close to
There were
it.
framed
She
drawings
was
over
wearing
the
it the
desk,
night Juliet
pajamas
had
in the bottom drawer,
6:14 in the
She had
morning,
her
worn
books
it
on
the morning
nightstand,
she died.
and a small
Bridget,
lamp
currently
Isabella had
in
set
that's
down.
Elizabeth's work.
Every
I
time
knew
she
what
slept in
safety
her
meant.
grandparents' house,
Bridget,
that
P.S.
was
was from my
she
Elizabeth
father.
isn't applying this
Except when I
one
opened
line.
the door that
She's Lily
afternoon,
for hospice.
half
Your
of
mother
those
Juliet
things
applies
gone.
June 1st.
Her
Be
books
smart.
had been stacked
It's just
inside
helping
a cardboard
Juliet have
box
material.
inside the closet. The framed drawings had been taken off the wall. A pink overnight bag I recognized as Peyton sat on the chair, and a sweater that definitely wasn't Isabella's hung from the bedpost. Nancy hadn't made a spontaneous decision during Thanksgiving dinner. Someone had already prepared the room. Isabella stood beside me without touching anything. "Grandma already moved my stuff." "Yes," I said. She looked up. "Did I do something?" That question hit harder than my mother's announcement downstairs. "No, you didn't do anything." Peyton appeared quietly in the doorway behind us. She looked embarrassed. "Grandma said you barely come here anymore," she told Isabella. "She said you wouldn't care." Isabella looked at her cousin, then back at the box. I could see exactly how easily this could become a fight between two little girls who hadn't made a single adult decision. "Peyton, this isn't your fault," I said. "And Isabella, it isn't yours either." Peyton nodded and disappeared.
Until a
Granny is
Tuesday
resting.
afternoon,
I crouched
when a
beside
single
Isabella.
text message
"We're going home
quietly
tonight."
She doesn't have
dismantled
her
the
eyes moved
illusion
toward the
that
hallway.
he
That's not your
ever
call.
truly
I don't
belonged.
have to
He
sleep
The
closed
message
doors.
came through at
No.
2:17
I stood on the
p.m.
porch in the
while
May
Ethan was
and
reviewing a
listened
quarterly
through the door to
report
my
wasn't going to
from a
teach my daughter
particularly
to follow
slow-moving
the holiday
client.
peaceful.
Don't let her get
His
into
phone
my
buzzed
I
once,
walked back to
just
my
a
car.
soft vibration on the
Before I
desk.
pulled away,
He
I
He
heard the
glanced
back
at the
door of
screen,
their house open,
expecting a
and my
work-related
mother
reminder,
crawled out across the
or maybe a
lawn.
weather
When we
alert.
went
gone.
back downstairs,
But
You can come
instead,
over now.
it was
Kayla
from his
something
mother.
about
She was called-
leftover pie. Nobody mentioned the room. I sat beside Ryan again, and that was when I noticed the key ring beside Kayla's plate. There was a black plastic tag hanging from it with the silver Holloway Residential Group logo. My company. Technically, my father's company and mine. Dad had founded Holloway Residential Group long before I was old enough to understand what a building permit was. By that Thanksgiving, he still owned 65%. I owned 35 and had spent years as chief operating officer helping turn a messy family operation into a regional residential company with actual systems, controls, and accountability. Kayla had never worked there. I looked at the key tag again. Nancy noticed. Kayla and Peyton are going to be around a lot more now, she said. I turned toward my sister. Around where? Kayla opened her mouth, but my mother answered first. Sarah, can we just have dinner? My father still wouldn't look at me. That bothered me more than Nancy's tone. I picked up my phone again, this time openly enough that Ryan glanced at the screen. I logged into the corporate card portal tied to our business banking system. I wasn't looking for Kayla at first. I wanted to see whether a company access credential had been issued without coming through operations. Then I saw her name, Kayla Holloway Grant. Status, active. Under it was a cost center label I had never approved. Community relations. I felt something inside me go very quiet. There were only a few reasons a company card should exist, and none of them included surprising the COO at Thanksgiving. I opened the card details. I did not close an account. I did not move money. I did not touch payroll. I used the authority I already had as an administrator and tapped one option. Lock card. A confirmation appeared. I set the phone down and ate another bite of mashed potatoes. For several minutes, nobody said anything important. Nancy talked about a neighbor's new porch. William asked Ryan whether traffic had been bad. Kayla barely spoke. Isabella sat close enough that her knee touched mine beneath the table. Then Nancy's phone buzzed. She glanced at it. Her expression changed before she could hide it. The fork fell from her hand. What did you do? The entire table went silent. I looked at her. To what? You know exactly what I mean. That answer gave me more information than she realized. I locked a corporate card I never approved. My father finally looked up. Sarah, not here. I held his gaze. Then someone should have told me before here. Nancy pushed back from the table. You embarrassed your sister because you're angry about a bedroom. No, I said. I locked a card because I don't know why my sister has one. Kayla looked at Nancy. Not at me. That was another detail I filed away. Ryan stood this time, and I did too. I helped Isabella into her coat while Nancy followed us into the foyer, insisting that everybody was overreacting. She said the downstairs bedroom was perfectly comfortable. She said Peyton needed stability. She said Kayla was going through a difficult period. None of that answered the question I had actually asked. Why did Kayla have a company card? I didn't fight with my mother on the porch. I didn't make Isabella stand there listening while adults argued about which child deserved more. I simply told Nancy we were going home, wished my father a good night, and walked out with my husband and daughter. 20 minutes later, Ryan was driving us through the dark suburban streets toward our house while Isabella leaned against the back seat window. I opened the corporate card profile again. Kayla's name was still there. So was the label beneath it. Community relations. I didn't yet know whether that meant a temporary cost center, a new assignment, or something bigger. What I knew was that my sister had a company key, an active corporate card, and enough connection to our business that my mother received an alert the second I locked it. By the time we pulled into our driveway, I wasn't wondering why Nancy had taken Isabella's room anymore. I was wondering what else she had already made room for. The next morning, Isabella was already awake when I came downstairs. She was sitting at the kitchen island in her pajamas with a bowl of cereal in front of her. But she wasn't eating much. Ryan was making coffee, and for a few minutes neither of us said anything about Thanksgiving. Then Isabella looked at me and asked, Do I have to go back for my books today? I set my phone down and told her no. Nothing in that room was worth making her walk back into my parents' house before she was ready. We'll get your things when you want them, I said. You don't have to rush because somebody else decided to move them. She nodded, and that was enough for the moment. After she went upstairs to get dressed, Ryan handed me a mug and leaned against the counter. Tell me exactly
I have been
what
an
that card
ICU
means.
nurse for 8
He
years.
had been beside me the night before.
I know exactly
but I
what
hadn't explained much in
1.5
front of
milligrams per
Isabella.
hour of
I
morphine
told him the
does
simple
to an
version
82-year-old
first.
woman
My
in
father
post-op
still
day
owns
2.
65%
I
of
looked at the
Holloway
IV
Residential
pump.
Group.
I looked
owned
at Brenda.
35.
Something had
Brenda
I was the COO.
looked at the IV pump.
She no
My
longer
mother
I
was
said
owned none of it.
quietly,
She had
the
never
way
been
you
an
talk in a
officer,
room with a
never
sleeping
sat on any
patient.
board, and
Brenda,
had no authority
she's
to
on a
decide
1.5
succession.
milligram
But
morphine drip.
years earlier,
You can't
before the
notarize
company
this.
had grown,
You know
she
you
had
can't.
handled a lot of back office
Oren
work
Harris
for my
stated of the
father.
two essays.
Payroll
The
questions,
overlap is
expense
get on your knees and
reports,
beg, you
vendor
ungrateful
paperwork,
bit. The
card
phrase,
administration.
maybe
Her
then we'll
window,
return
even
your
after we
grandmother's
hired
thing.
people
And
to
she
do most
watched
of
the
that
sunrise. That was the
professionally.
last
Some of her
message
old
my mother
commissions
sent
had
me.
never
Appears
been
verbatim
removed.
in your father
Ryan
replied
looked
right
at it over the
after.
rim of his cup.
The probability is ours
now.
siblings independently
I know.
writing that sentence on
3 years
video
earlier,
the same
I
patient
had
stay
made
dead
a
to this
list of
family. In
legacy
our view,
assets
3 months
that no
after my
longer made
grandmother
sense.
died
The
in
committee will
hospital,
require
they
that
demanded I
secretaries
drive
of
100
editors
miles or
before
escalate
kneel
into
in
a
their
courtroom
delegated
hearing
access
and
to
thank
a
them.
shared executive inbox my father used for vendor and ownership inquiries. I had wanted to strip everything back to formal job responsibilities. Dad had pushed back immediately. He had said Mom only helped with paperwork, that removing her would feel insulting after everything she had done for the company in the early years. At the time, I had decided it wasn't worth turning into a family argument. Ryan remembered my exact words. You said, Mom doesn't touch anything important. I winced. Apparently I was wrong. That bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I wasn't angry with myself because Nancy had abused access. That part belonged to Nancy. But I had seen a control problem years earlier and let family discomfort talk me out of fixing it. I had always believed I was good at separating emotion from work. That morning, I had to admit there was one place where I hadn't done it well enough. Once Isabella left for a play date with a friend down the street, I went into my home office and logged into the company systems I was authorized to use. The corporate card portal from Thanksgiving had told me only that Kayla had an active card assigned to community relations. It hadn't told me whether she actually worked for us. Our employee directory answered that question in less than a minute. Kayla Holloway Grant, Community Relations Coordinator, Company Email active, Payroll Profile active, Start date, October 20. I stared at the date for several seconds. She had been in the system for more than 5 weeks. That wasn't a Thanksgiving surprise. It was a plan. There was no executive title, no outrageous salary, nothing that screamed coup. Her compensation was ordinary for the role. That almost made it worse. Whoever had done this had been careful enough to make every individual piece look reasonable. A modest community relations position. A company email. A card. Nothing dramatic on its own, but I hadn't approved any of it. I opened the folder where job descriptions were usually stored. Kayla's was thin. There were a few generic responsibilities about sponsor events, local partnerships, client outreach, and community presence. No clear reporting line. No formal note showing why the role had been created. No email asking operations to review headcount. Just enough paperwork to make the position exist. That was when I thought about the rule Nancy used to mock. 2 years earlier, after we had several employees submit sloppy expense reports, I had tightened the corporate card process. Every charge needed a receipt, a project code when applicable, and a short business purpose. Nancy had laughed when I introduced it. You need paperwork to buy paper clips now? She had said in front of Dad. I had told her yes. If the paper clips were charged to the company, at the time it had been a boring policy discussion. That morning, I was grateful I had been boring. My phone buzzed on the desk, the family group chat.
Walked into the kitchen, poured himself a glass of water, and leaned against the counter in silence. His thoughts didn't race. His heart didn't pound. It was more like a quiet click inside his chest, like a door gently closing. He opened his laptop, logged into the travel portal he had used to book the honeymoon flights business class round trip to Maui. He had placed them under his own email address and credit card because Marilyn had mentioned her credit wasn't strong enough to secure the reservation.
Nancy answered almost immediately. This is exactly what I mean. You're making business out of family. I didn't reply. If she wanted to argue about feelings, she could do that without me. I wanted facts. I went back to the card portal and reviewed the transactions available under Kayla's profile. I wasn't looking for a giant theft. I was looking for context. Most of the activity was boring enough to be believable. Lunch connected to a sponsor event, printing costs, mileage-related purchases, a small vendor charge. Then I saw several items that didn't fit as neatly. Furniture charged under model home staging. A restaurant meal listed as client development. a storage unit payment, a moving-related charge. None of them was huge. Altogether, the questionable items were only a few $1,000s. That was important. If I had seen $50,000 disappearing in a month, I would have known immediately that something was badly wrong. What I saw instead was more dangerous in a different way. Every charge was small enough to explain. I opened the furniture entry first. The vendor was legitimate. We had bought from them before for staging model homes. The category made sense at a glance. But the delivery reference didn't match any active model home project I recognized. I checked the storage charge. No project number attached. The restaurant expense had a business purpose note, but it was vague enough to be useless. Community relationship. I started a spreadsheet. Date. Merchant. Original amount. Current category. Business purpose. Project code. Approver. Ryan walked into the office sometime later and looked at the screen. Anything bad? Nothing I can prove is bad yet. That sounds like you. I looked at him. He smiled slightly. It's a compliment. It was also accurate. I didn't want to become the kind of person who decided what happened first and then searched for evidence to support it. If Kayla had legitimate expenses, I wanted them counted as legitimate. If my father had approved relocation assistance through the company, I wanted to know what he had actually approved. Anger was not an accounting category. By early afternoon, I had more questions than answers. Then I opened the company calendar. Community events were not my day-to-day responsibility. We had people handling sponsorships, local partnerships, and public-facing appearances, and I rarely reviewed every invitation unless it affected operations or budget. That explained how I could have missed individual appearances by Kayla. But one entry made me stop. A sponsor dinner scheduled for the following week. Kayla's name was listed beside my father's. Under internal notes were 4 words: second-generation leadership. I read them twice. Not community support. Not event staff.
Drug-free
Leadership.
workplace.
That was the first
Random
moment I stopped
testing in
asking whether
effect.
my mother had simply
I
found
had
my sister
passed
a
my
job.
December screen
I
3
started
weeks
asking
earlier.
whether someone
I
had
called
been
my old
building
church
her
friend
a
Bethany
future
on
inside the
speakerphone
company before
and
I
asked her
even knew she
gently
had entered it.
what people were
Monday
saying.
morning, I got to
She
Holloway
paused for
Residential
a long
Group
time.
before 7:30.
She said,
The office was still
Patty
quiet,
says you've been
except for
struggling
the
with
receptionist
substances
setting
and
out
toxic
mail and one project
influences.
manager already
She says
arguing
they've
with
had
a
to set
subcontractor
hard
on
boundaries to
speakerphone.
protect Mama.
Nothing looked different, which
Substances
somehow made
and
everything feel
toxic
more wrong.
influence.
48 hours earlier, I had discovered my sister had been on our payroll for 5 weeks without my knowledge. Now I was standing in the lobby watching the same lights come on, the same coffee machine sputter to life, and the same employees swipe their badges as if nothing unusual had happened. Then Kayla walked through the front doors and used a company access badge of her own. She saw me immediately. Her hand paused near the reader for half a second before the lock clicked open. She was wearing black slacks, a cream sweater, and the expression of someone who had already rehearsed several explanations but hoped she wouldn't need any of them. "Morning," she said. I looked at the badge clipped to her bag. Morning. That was all. I wasn't going to question her in a lobby where anyone walking past could hear us. Whatever had happened, I was still the COO, and I wasn't going to turn the office into a stage for a family fight. My father arrived 15 minutes later. I followed him into his office and closed the door behind me. William Holloway had spent most of his adult life building things, and even at 67, he still had the habit of standing over blueprints, as if he could physically force a problem into making sense. He glanced at me once, then kept opening his laptop. "I know why you're here." "Good. Who hired Kayla?" He exhaled. I approved it. I had expected that answer and still hated hearing it. Why wasn't I told?
Marilyn,
Dad leaned
we
back
all
on
So my
agreed you're
sister
not
could
welcome
come.
at the
I thought
wedding.
you knew.
3 days
No
later,
punctuation,
the hospice
no
coordinator
explanation.
from Interim
Just that
Healthcare
smug
in
little
Greenville
dash
told me,
she
You
always
knew I
used
liked
in
Will on
place of a
Thursday.
period.
Southern
That's why you
Ethan
went
stared at the
Minutes
message,
later,
unsure
your
if his
parents
eyes
had
were playing
indicated
tricks
that
on
the
him.
patient's
He
He read it
emotional
again.
stability,
Your mother
Then
told
again.
certain
Maya to
family
bring
The
Maya
members
words
in.
did
didn't
not
change.
visit
It
unannounced.
It wasn't entirely a
She
shock,
said you
so
didn't want
sorry.
another meeting
The
about
signs
it.
This is
had been
a
there
family
subtle,
decision we have to
That was
accumulating
the
over
first
months.
direct confirmation
He
that
hadn't
I
been
sat in the
included in the
parking
group
lot of
photo planning,
Walgreens with the
I
call
hadn't
asked him
received
what
an invite to the
exactly
engagement.
he had signed. He opened a folder and showed me the basics. Hiring authorization, payroll setup, access request, corporate card approval. None of it was forged. His signature was there. That mattered. If I wanted the truth, I couldn't pretend my mother had done everything behind my father's back. He had approved it. He had simply done so while believing a version of events that had never included me. "Why didn't you ask me yourself?" I said. Dad's jaw tightened. "Because I didn't think every small decision needed to go through you. That's not the same as thinking I knew." He looked toward the window. "The company needs more than one daughter involved, Sarah." That sentence landed differently than anything else he had said. I had been expecting an explanation about helping Kayla through a difficult year. I had not been expecting succession language. What does that mean? It means this business has always been about family. It's also a company with 42 employees. And I built it. I know. He leaned forward. "Then stop acting like bringing your sister in is some kind of invasion." I stared at him. "I'm not angry because she has a desk. I'm asking why someone told you I approved something I never heard about." He didn't answer that. Instead, he told me Kayla's role was modest, that she would handle community partnerships, sponsor events, local outreach, and some client-facing work. He said she was good with people. He said I was already carrying too much. Every sentence sounded reasonable until I noticed what was missing. He never once said he had spoken directly to me before making the decision. When I left his office, Kayla was sitting at a workstation near the marketing and community relations side of the floor. She wasn't occupying an executive office. She wasn't pretending to be my equal. Her setup was ordinary: laptop, company phone, notepad, coffee cup. That helped me separate what I felt from what I actually knew. My sister had accepted a job. The secrecy around the job was the problem. I stopped beside her desk. "Can we talk for a minute?" She followed me into a small conference room. I closed the door. "Mom told Dad I approved your position." Kayla frowned. "She told me you wanted me here." I studied her face, but I didn't try to read thoughts into it. "Those are two different things. She said you needed somebody to take over the public side because you were stretched too thin." "I never said that." Kayla crossed her arms. "Then why would she tell me you did?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." Her defensiveness rose immediately. "I didn't sneak in here, Sarah. Dad signed everything." "I know. I'm not taking your job." "I didn't say you were. You're acting like I stole something." "I'm asking why everyone was told I knew." That stopped her. After a few seconds, she said, "Mom handled the details. I thought you two had already talked." The pattern was becoming harder to ignore. Dad had thought I knew because Nancy told him I knew. Kayla had thought I wanted her there because Nancy told her I did. Two people had made decisions involving me without speaking to me because both had been told the conversation had already happened. I didn't accuse Kayla of anything else. Not yet. I told her I was reviewing the process and went back to my office. For the next hour, I traced where Kayla had appeared publicly. Community relations wasn't part of my daily operational workload, and in a company our size, I didn't review every sponsored dinner, charity photo, or social media post. That had always been intentional. If I needed to approve every event invitation personally, we had bigger management problems than my sister. Still, the pattern was easy to see once I knew to look. Kayla had attended a housing charity luncheon with my father in late October. A week later, she appeared in a photograph with two suppliers we had worked with for years. Then came a local school fundraiser, a neighborhood association sponsorship, and a community development breakfast. None of those events was suspicious by itself. What caught my attention was how often she was positioned beside Dad. I opened the social media archive. One caption read, "Founder William Holloway joined by daughter Kayla Grant as the next generation of Holloway family leadership continues."
Finish the coffee. Elizabeth will write something else next year.
I read it twice.
And walked back into the ICU to chart for the next 40 minutes
Kayla
like
had
it was
worked
any
with
other
us in
Thursday.
3 weeks when that
Bridget,
was
none of
posted.
my coworkers
I
knew my
searched
grandmother.
internal
We have
calendar
one
notes,
shot to get
and
one
I
of them
found
to
a
Yale at a
sponsored dinner I
family.
had
Juliet's
noticed twice.
MCAT isn't strong enough to make
Beside
sure of
Kayla's
it.
name,
This is
the
parenting.
text
came
reads,
at 6:38 more messages. I had just put a frozen lasagna in the microwave at my most of them were small. Reminders,
The phone
buzz,
buzzed
coordinations.
The
The
someone
first
was
message
creating
about
the
which
image
mother
before creating the reality. I went back to the expense file. The furniture charge was still bothering me. I pulled the attached receipt and compared it with the active project list. The vendor was one we regularly used for model home staging, so the category could have passed a casual review. But the delivery reference didn't match any of our model homes. I checked the storage payment next. No project number. The moving-related expense had been coded under community outreach support, which made little sense unless I was missing documentation. I wasn't ready to call anything improper. I made another column in my spreadsheet. Possible legitimate explanation. For the furniture, I wrote temporary event staging. For the storage unit, I wrote sponsor materials. For the moving charge, I left the cell blank. Then I noticed something strange about the furniture entry. The current project code was clean and specific. Too specific. I pulled the audit history. The transaction had originally been submitted under a generic category with a vague note. 2 days later, the project code had been changed. That could happen. Employees made mistakes. Administrators corrected them all the time. I checked who made the correction. Nancy Holloway. He sat back. My mother had no operational role. She had no reason to be assigning project codes unless somebody had specifically asked her to fix administrative paperwork. That was possible. I refused to skip that step. So I checked another questionable transaction. Original category, general community expense. Later revision, client development. Changed by Nancy Holloway. A third one, original submission. Relocation support. Later revision. Project logistics. Changed by Nancy Holloway. I stopped typing. This wasn't proof of theft. It wasn't even proof that the expenses were illegitimate. But it was proof of something I had not known on Thanksgiving. My mother had not simply encouraged my father to give Kayla a job. She had been inside the records, changing how certain expenses looked after they were submitted. And for the first time since she dropped that fork at Thanksgiving dinner, I understood why her reaction had been so fast. Nancy wasn't watching this from the sidelines. She was already inside the system. By Tuesday morning, I had stopped asking whether the expense changes were isolated mistakes. I pulled every transaction I could legitimately review that connected to Kayla's card, her department, or the weeks immediately after she had been hired. Most of them were ordinary. Printing for a neighborhood event was exactly what it claimed to be. A lunch with a local housing nonprofit had names, receipts, and a clear business purpose. Mileage lined up with scheduled events. I was almost relieved whenever something made sense, because I did not want to build a case around anger. But a smaller group of charges kept bothering me. A storage payment that had started as a generic expense was later tied to project logistics. A moving-related charge had been shifted into community outreach. The furniture purchase that had no matching model home delivery had been assigned a clean project code 2 days after submission. Every one of those changes had been made from the same administrative account, Nancy Holloway. I printed nothing I didn't need and forwarded nothing outside the systems I was authorized to use. I simply built a timeline. Date of charge. Original description. Original category. Revised category. Time of change. User who made the change. I also added a column called Possible Legitimate Explanation, because I knew how dangerous certainty could become when you were already angry. Maybe the storage unit held event materials. Maybe the furniture had been temporarily
Her name,
staged
the
with
child
somewhere I hadn't
student,
been
was
holding
9
up.
years old. Everyone
Maybe
she
my
died
father had
Connie
approved
later.
relocation
To me,
assistance
she was
and
Granny
had
Lily.
coded it
She
badly.
lived for
Juliet opened her
52
mouth.
years in a
Possibilities
small
mattered.
white
Elizabeth,
house
what
on
also
Mountain
mattered
View
was
Road in
understanding
Travelers
one of the
Rest,
files
South
showed why my
Carolina.
mother had
I
been
did not
personally
town in the
avoiding
foothills
them.
where the road
By
bends
Wednesday,
north,
I had
and
shown
the
the
air
pattern
smells
that
like
I
I have your
mistake
essay
I would later
Hein.
regret.
I have my
In
draft.
February, I called
I have the
Nancy.
house had a
She answered on the
sideboard. I have
third
mom's
ring.
wing my
I needed
granddad
patience.
had built
She
her
used
in
I never wanted to feel
1971.
guilty
I am
before
not
I had
asking
even
you. It
said
had a
one
kitchen
thing.
with a cast
Are you
iron.
finally calling to apologize? No, I'm calling about company expenses. She went silent for just long enough to tell me she had expected the subject. What now? I found several charges connected to Kayla that were recoded after submission from your administrator account. That's called fixing paperwork, Sarah. Why were you fixing Kayla's paperwork? Because people send things in wrong all the time? That wasn't my question. Nancy exhaled loudly. Your father approved helping your sister? Kayla had to move. She needed a few things. You're acting like we bought her a yacht. I haven't said anything about theft. I'm asking why charges that looked personal were later assigned to company categories. Because they had company purposes. Then there should be documentation showing that. There probably is. Where? Her tone changed. The irritation didn't disappear, but it sharpened. You know, this is exactly what I mean when I say you make everything harder than it has to be. Your father makes a simple decision to help your sister, and suddenly you need spreadsheets and investigations. That simple decision involved telling Dad I approved a job I never knew existed. Oh, please, Kayla isn't replacing you. I didn't say she was. You don't have to. It's obvious what this is about. That was the moment I should have stopped talking. I had enough information to know something was wrong, but not enough to know the full shape of it. Instead, I let my anger make the next decision for me. I'm reviewing everything connected to related party spending, I said. Nancy went quiet again. Not defensive this time. Interested. What does that mean? It means every expense connected to Kayla is being reviewed against the original submission, the current coding, and the approval record. And you think you have the right to do that? I'm the COO. Your father owns the company. And I own 35% of it. She laughed once without humor. There it is. There, what is? You finally said it. I should have hung up then. Instead, I asked, said what? That you think this is already yours? She ended the call before I could answer. An hour later, Dad walked into my office without knocking. Did you call your mother and tell her you're investigating the family? I told her I'm reviewing company expenses. She says you're treating Kayla like a criminal. I specifically told her I wasn't accusing anyone of theft. She says you're pulling every charge she's ever made. Dad, I am looking at a small group of transactions that were recoded after submission. He stood there with his hands on his hips, already irritated enough that I knew Nancy had reached him before I could. You need to slow down. What exactly do you want me to stop doing? Turning this into something it isn't. What is it then? He didn't answer directly. Your sister needed help. I approved help. Fine. Show me what you approved. I don't appreciate being interrogated in my own company. That phrase bothered me. Not because the company had never been his. It had. He had built it. But the way he said it told me this was no longer just about Kayla's expenses. Nancy had successfully moved the argument somewhere else. Ownership, control, loyalty. I had handed her the opening by telling her exactly what I was reviewing. By that afternoon, the consequences were obvious. Our bookkeeper, Dana, stopped by my office holding a folder against her chest. She looked uncomfortable. Just so you know, William asked me to route anything related to Kayla's reimbursements through him for now. Did he tell you not to give me records? No, he said he wants to review them first. I nodded. If anything is part of our normal operating records and I'm authorized to see it, keep following normal retention. Don't delete, move, or alter anything because of this. I wouldn't. I know. I'm just being clear. Dana hesitated. Nancy picked up a couple of physical folders yesterday. She said William wanted them at home. That was not ideal, but it was not proof of wrongdoing either. My father often took documents home. Nancy had handled paperwork for him for years. What changed was that now I knew my mother understood I was looking at coding histories, and some of the physical files I might have used for context were no longer sitting in the office. The electronic records were still there, the logs were still there, nothing had vanished. But I had lost surprise. That was my fault. I had spent years telling employees not to announce a problem before they understood it well enough to solve it. Then, I had done exactly that because the person on the other end of the phone was my mother. Thursday evening, I came home later than usual and found Isabella sitting cross-legged on her bedroom floor. She had pulled open the bottom drawer of her dresser and was looking at a pair of pajamas Nancy had bought her the previous Christmas. Mom? Yeah? Can we get all my stuff from Grandma's this weekend? We can. Even the books? Of course. And the lamp? Yes. She traced one finger over the pattern on the pajamas. What if she gives those away too? I sat beside her. She won't. How do you know? I'll make sure we get them. She looked at me for a second. I mean, why did she give my room away? I answered too quickly. You have a better room here anyway. Isabella's expression changed. That's not what I asked. The words landed harder because they were so simple. I had been doing exactly what adults had done to me my entire life. Converting hurt into practicality. You have more. You're fine. You can handle it. So why does the loss matter? I leaned back against her bed. You're right. She waited. I don't know why Grandma thought it was okay to decide that without asking you. And I'm sorry I answered a different question. Isabella nodded, still serious. I liked that room. I know. We don't have to fight about it. No. But I don't want to sleep there anymore. You don't have to. Later, after she was asleep, Ryan found me at the kitchen table with my laptop open and a legal pad beside it. I had barely touched the notes. You okay? He asked. I told Mom what I was reviewing. I know. Dad is routing records through himself now. Nancy took some physical folders home. Did anything get deleted? No. Did you lose access? Not yet. He sat across from me. Then you made a mistake, not a fatal one. I stared at the page. I knew better. You're allowed to know better and still screw up. I handed her the playbook. You handed her one page. I closed the laptop. I was trying to get an answer. No, Ryan said. You were trying to get your mother to admit you were right before you had finished proving it. I looked at him. He didn't soften it. And I think you're still doing something else. What? Trying to protect your dad. That's ridiculous. Is it? I started to answer, but he kept going. You keep saying Nancy changed the records. Nancy told lies. Nancy moved information around. All true. But William signed things. He hired Kayla. He listened to your mother instead of calling you. Are you trying to protect the company? Or are you trying to protect your dad from finding out what his wife did with decisions he approved? I hated the question because I knew exactly why he was asking it. For most of my adult life, I had been the one who translated bad family behavior into less damaging language. Dad was tired, Mom was stressed, Kayla was struggling. Nobody meant it like that. I had always thought that made me practical. Maybe sometimes it had just made me useful to everyone except myself. My phone buzzed beside the laptop. A text from Dad. Tomorrow morning, my office. Bring everything you think you found, and we need to talk about the buyer. I read it twice. Ryan watched my face. What buyer? I looked up at him. I have no idea. Friday morning, Dad was already in his office when I arrived. The door was open, and the first thing I noticed was the printed email on his desk. I recognized the subject line before I could read anything else. Strategic Acquisition Inquiry Holloway Residential Group. He tapped the page with one finger. This is what I meant last night. I picked it up and read the first few lines. A regional builder had contacted us several weeks earlier asking whether Holloway Residential Group would ever consider a strategic acquisition or partnership. I remembered the inquiry. What I did not remember was ever discussing it with Dad because there had been nothing to discuss. I had answered that we were not interested. Where's the rest of the thread? I asked. Dad frowned. That's what your mother sent me. This isn't the whole thread. He leaned back. So there is more. Yes, my reply. What did you tell them? That we weren't interested. He studied me like he was deciding whether to believe me. That look bothered me almost more than the email itself. Then show me. I will. Nancy wasn't there, and for once I was grateful. I didn't want another argument built around partial information. The copy in Dad's hand was clearly a forward, not the original thread, and I wanted to see exactly what had been sent before I accused anybody of withholding anything. Dad told me he had received it weeks earlier and that it was one of the reasons he had started thinking more seriously about continuity. I asked him whether continuity meant Kayla. He said, "It means I don't want everything I built dependent on one person. One person who owns 35% and runs operations. That isn't what I meant." Then say what you mean. He looked toward the window instead. We'll talk after you show me the full email. That was as far as we got. I left his office with two things clear in my mind. First, somebody had given him a version of an acquisition inquiry that did not include my rejection. Second, he had allowed that incomplete version to influence decisions about Kayla without ever asking me what actually happened. Even if Nancy had manipulated him, he had still chosen silence. I didn't confront him again that morning. I had already learned what happened when I announced a conclusion before I had finished building it. Instead, I called Kayla. She sounded tired. If this is about
Phone
the
lit
card
up again.
We're going to play three
A
things.
message.
Annabelle
I want
This
to
said.
ask
time,
you one
it
question.
wasn't
Then
from
we're going to
Marilyn.
talk.
And I want you to
It
answer
wasn't
it
from
She
instead of
started
Rachel.
click
calling
three.
It
Mom
wasn't
first.
even
My
from one
mother
of the
watches
cousins,
us.
who
On a
likely had
wall
no
mounted
idea
Who
what
told you
had
I
just
had a
happened.
stranger's
conference
It was
room.
from his
Mom,
father,
Slide her
Thomas
own
Miller.
mother's engagement
You
ring
around?
off her own
I think
mother's
you should
finger.
see something.
She said you
The
were
Just
audio
that.
is
overloaded
perfectly
and wanted
7
clear.
Sarah to
words.
take over the
No
It's okay,
drama,
Mama.
no
I'm just gonna
emotion.
look at it.
She said you thought
Just
I
a
would
quiet
do
flag
that.
in the wind,
I never said that.
signaling
mother
that whatever
opened
Ethan
that.
had assumed about
Did
the
you ever hear it
boundaries
from
of this
Dad?
family
That's it.
fracture.
No. Dad said he was glad I was coming in, but by then I thought you already knew. Did you ask him if I approved it? Another pause. No. Why not? Her voice hardened. Because I didn't think I needed permission from my sister to work for my father. That isn't what I asked. She went quiet. I told her I wanted to meet somewhere neutral, not the office and not our parents' house. She reluctantly agreed to coffee Saturday morning. When Kayla arrived, she looked like she hadn't slept well. I had brought my phone. She had hers. I didn't start with accusations. I opened the message thread between Nancy and me and scrolled to the weeks before Thanksgiving. I showed Kayla one message. Mom, Kayla begged your father for a job. I told him not to put you in the middle. Kayla stared at it. I never begged Dad for anything. What did she tell you? Kayla unlocked her phone and searched. Mom, Sarah thinks you'd be perfect for community relations. She knows you're good with people. We placed the phones beside each other on the table. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. I opened another message. Mom to me. Kayla expects the company to help with her move. Your father is trying to be kind. Kayla's eyes narrowed. She searched again and turned her phone toward me. Mom to Kayla. Your dad insisted relocation should be covered since this move is tied to work. Don't feel guilty. I read it twice. Did Dad tell you that? No. Did you ask him? No. Did you ask me? No. Kayla sat back and folded her arms, but the defensiveness looked different now, less angry, more embarrassed. I asked, why? She looked past me toward the window. Because I wanted to believe it. That Mom was telling the truth? That you wanted me there. I didn't say anything. She rubbed her thumb against the edge of her phone. Do you know what it feels like to have everyone in the family treat you like the one who can't keep anything together? You had a career before I even figured out what I wanted to do. You had Dad's respect. You had systems and plans and all that stuff you're good at. When Mom told me you thought I could help with something you couldn't do alone, I liked hearing it. That doesn't explain the card. I know. Or the expenses. I know. Or why you never called me. She looked at me then. I knew something about it felt off. I just didn't want to ask a question that might take it away. That was the first honest thing she had said about her own part in it. I didn't forgive her in that moment. I didn't tell her it was all Mom's fault. Kayla had accepted a job, a company card, and relocation help without confirming any of the story that made those things sound legitimate. Nancy may have built the lie, but Kayla had benefited from not testing it. Still, the picture had changed. I had spent most of the week thinking my sister and my mother had planned this together. Now it looked more like Nancy had told each of us a different version of reality.
At the time, it had seemed like a small favor, one of many. He clicked cancel. The page processed for a moment before confirming the refund, $3,800, deposited back to his account within 5 to 7 business days. He moved on to his banking app, found the transfer record from 3 weeks prior, $6,500 wired to Marilyn's account, marked as wedding gift honeymoon support. He reversed it.
Then I noticed
saw
a
an
woman
email
standing
subject
2
once.
feet behind
Where?
Patty.
On her laptop.
Light blue scrubs.
She had the shared executive
Name
inbox
tag
open
Brenda
when she was
Markham,
doing paperwork for Dad.
RN.
I remember the subject
I didn't
because I
recognize
asked if
her
somebody
from this
wanted
floor.
to buy the company.
She wasn't a
Mom shut
circulating
the
nurse.
laptop and said it was
She wasn't a
complicated.
charge nurse.
That answer
but she had a
mattered.
notary stamp
Not
in her
because
hand.
Kayla had given
A
me
lot of
proof.
South Carolina nurses
She
pick up a
hadn't.
notary commission for
She had given
$50
me a
of side
pad.
income.
Nancy had never
Patty
needed
had
access
clearly
to my
arranged it
personal
ahead
email.
of time.
The acquisition
She had been
inquiry
waiting
gone
for
through
the
our shared
morphine.
executive mailbox, and Nancy still had delegated access to it. Sunday afternoon, Ryan and I went to my parents' house to pick up the rest of Isabella's belongings. I had deliberately chosen a time when Isabella was with a friend. I didn't want her standing in the hallway while Nancy tried to turn a cardboard box into another argument. Peyton was there. She came downstairs carrying a small plastic container decorated with faded stickers. This was in the desk. I opened it. Inside were 2 friendship bracelets, a handful of colored pens, 3 photographs, and a folded drawing Isabella had made of herself and Peyton standing under a huge yellow sun. Grandma said Isabella wouldn't care if I kept it, Peyton said. I closed the lid carefully. Thank you for giving it back. I didn't want it if it was hers. That was the right thing to do. Nancy appeared at the end of the hallway. You don't have to make this into some ceremony, Sarah. I'm picking up my daughter's things. She could still stay here whenever she wants. Not downstairs because you gave away the room you told her was hers. Nancy crossed her arms. Peyton needs stability right now. Then give Peyton stability. You didn't need to humiliate Isabella to do it. Her mouth tightened. There you go again. Everything has to be an accusation. I almost brought up Kayla's texts. I didn't. I had learned something that week. Information was useful only until you gave your opponent time to explain it away. So I picked up the box and left. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the 2 conversations still open on my phone. Nancy telling me Kayla had begged for help. Nancy telling Kayla I had invited her in. Nancy telling me Kayla expected the company to pay. Nancy telling Kayla Dad had insisted. Then I wrote 3 words at the top of a fresh page. Shared executive mailbox. 3 years earlier, I had wanted to remove Nancy's delegated access to it. I had decided it wasn't worth the argument. Now I finally understood how one of the smallest compromises I had made in the name of keeping peace might have given my mother exactly what she needed to turn my father's fear into a plan I was never supposed to see. Monday morning, I went straight to the shared executive mailbox before I did anything else. Holloway Residential Group had used that address for years for ownership inquiries, major vendor introductions, lender correspondence, and anything that needed to reach my father and me without disappearing into one person's inbox. Nancy still had delegated access from the years when she handled administrative paperwork for Dad. I had known that. I had simply stopped thinking of it as dangerous. I searched the subject line Kayla remembered and found the acquisition inquiry within seconds. The original message was exactly what I remembered. A regional builder had reached out to ask whether Holloway Residential Group would consider discussing a strategic acquisition or partnership. There was no offer, no valuation, no negotiation, and no secret meeting. I had answered the same day. My reply was still sitting directly under the inquiry in the thread. Thank you for reaching out. We are not considering a sale of the company, but I appreciate your interest. It was short because there had been nothing more to say. I sat there looking at the entire exchange and felt something colder than anger. The message Dad had shown me Friday had not been forged. Nobody had changed a word. Nancy had simply forwarded the part that created fear and left out the part that would have ended it. I checked the delegated access history. Nancy's access to the shared mailbox was still active, just as it had been for years. That did not prove when she had read that exact thread, but it established that she could have. More importantly, Dad already had the forward she had sent him. I printed the full thread, then printed the copy he had shown me Friday. Side by side, the difference was obvious. His version ended at the question, mine included the answer. I went into his office with both copies. Dad looked at them before he looked at me. You found it. I found the whole thing. He took the papers and read my reply twice. I told them no, I said. He rubbed his forehead. Your mother showed me the inquiry. She showed you part of it. She said you were being approached. I was approached. Then I declined. He looked up. Why didn't you tell me? Because companies get exploratory messages all the time. There was no deal to discuss. That is not the kind of thing you decide on your own. I didn't decide anything. I told somebody we weren't for sale. He stood and walked toward the window. Do you understand what that looked like to me? I almost laughed, but there was nothing funny in it. It looked exactly the way Mom wanted it to look. Dad turned. Don't do that. Do what? Make every decision I've made sound like your mother made it for me. I held his gaze. Then tell me why you never asked me. He didn't answer immediately. That silence told me more than defensiveness would have. Finally, he said, because I've been thinking about retiring. I know. And I don't know what happens after that. You've known I run operations. That isn't the same as what happens to the company. I waited. He looked down at the acquisition email again. You have your own ideas. You've professionalized everything. Policies, outside systems, controls. That's good. Most of it. But sometimes I wonder whether you see Holloway as a business first and a family company second. That doesn't mean I'm selling it. I didn't know that. You could have asked. His jaw tightened. That was the point. I refused to soften for him. Nancy had manipulated information. Dad had chosen not to verify it. Both things could be true. He sat back down. I thought if there was a chance you were preparing to leave, I needed another family member involved. Kyla. Yes. Without asking me. She's your sister. She's also an employee who was placed into a new role, under the claim that I approved it. Dad shook his head. You keep making this sound sinister. I'm making it sound documented. The door opened behind me. Nancy walked in carrying a folder. I had no idea how long she had been in the building, but her expression told me Dad had already spoken to her. What is documented? She asked. I turned. The full acquisition thread. She looked at the papers. For a second, she said nothing. Then she recovered. So you told them no? Yes. Good. I stared at her. Nancy put the folder on Dad's desk. Then maybe we can stop behaving as if the company is under attack. You sent Dad an incomplete thread. I forwarded the inquiry. You left out my answer. He needed to know there was interest. He needed the truth. He got the truth. Someone contacted you. And I declined. Nancy folded her arms. Sarah, you are acting as if your father had no reason to worry. He is 67 years old. He is planning to step back. You've spent years changing how everything works. Is it really so unreasonable that he wanted another daughter involved? There it was again. Not replacement. Balance. Fairness. Family. Words that sounded harmless until they were used to excuse decisions nobody had bothered to discuss with me. If I wasn't leaving, I said. Why did Kayla need to be inserted into leadership without me knowing? Nancy's eyes narrowed. Inserted into leadership? She organizes events. Then stop calling it second-generation leadership. Dad looked at Nancy. What is she talking about? Nancy didn't answer him directly. A caption, a few events, nothing formal. Then why the secrecy? Nancy turned back to me. Because every conversation with you becomes a procedure. That's not an answer. You make people feel like they need permission to breathe. I almost replied, but Dad lifted a hand. Enough. The room went quiet. He looked tired more than angry. That made what came next worse. I'm suspending your banking administration access for now. For a second, I thought I had heard him wrong. My what? Online banking and card administration, until this review is sorted out. Nancy didn't react. That told me she already knew. I looked at Dad. You're removing financial access from the COO after I raised questions about related party expenses. I'm cooling this down. No, you're changing control in the middle of a dispute. I am still the majority owner, and I am still a 35% shareholder. I'm not touching your shares. Good, because you can't make those disappear because you're uncomfortable. His face hardened. Sarah, no. If you want to suspend my operational access, put it in writing. Include what systems are affected and the effective time. Nancy stared at me like I had just confirmed every accusation she had made about me being cold. I didn't care. I had already made one mistake by letting emotion determine timing. I wasn't making another. By Tuesday morning, I had the written notice. My online banking and corporate card administrative privileges were temporarily suspended pending review. My ownership had not changed. My general access to operational records had not been revoked. I did not try to work around the restriction. I did not ask an employee to pull bank information for me. I did not use an old password or saved session. Once the boundary was written down, I treated it as real. Ryan read the notice at our kitchen table that evening. Are you resigning? No. Do you want to? For about 5 minutes every hour. He smiled, but I didn't. If I resign now, Mom gets to say I was unstable and walked out when Dad questioned me.
My
So what are
mother
you
had
going to
become a
do?
literature critic.
I'm going to stop
I
fighting
wrote
over
my
access.
grandmother a letter that
was the
night on
first
lined
time I had
yellow
said it out
paper.
loud. I had
I
spent the
told
last
her about
week
my
treating the
apartment in
problem like
Forest
sister I
Acres
needed to stay inside.
and the new fern I had
If Nancy
killed,
could limit my
and
access
the
by getting
patient
Dad
I had
scared
brought
enough,
back twice
then
on
I
the
needed
same
a
shift.
strategy that did not depend
I
on
told
being
her
the
I missed
person
her.
with the strongest
I
password.
sealed it.
I opened my
I
laptop
drove
and
to the
reviewed
post
what I
office
already
on a
had.
Tuesday and mailed it to
Transaction records I had
412 Mountain
legitimately
View Road,
accessed before
Travelers
the
Rest,
suspension,
South
my
Carolina.
spreadsheet, the full acquisition thread from the shared mailbox, and copies of the messages Kayla and I had compared. Then an automated company email arrived. Monthly expense archive. I had set that report years earlier to send on a recurring schedule because I hated discovering reconciliation problems at quarter end. It contained the prior period's transaction history and change logs generated before my banking access had been removed. I opened the attachment. The audit history timestamps were still there. The original categories were still there. The revised codes were still there. And Nancy's administrator account was still attached to the changes. I had lost access to the live controls. I had not lost the trail. The next morning, I stopped thinking like someone trying to get her access back, and started thinking like someone preparing to explain a system to people who could no longer pretend they did not understand it. I took the archived expense report, my spreadsheet, the full acquisition email thread, and the screenshots Kayla had agreed I could keep from our message comparison, then rebuilt the timeline from the beginning. I made separate columns for what I knew, what I suspected, and what still needed verification. If a charge had a plausible business purpose, I wrote that down. If William had approved it, I marked that clearly. If the only thing I could prove was that Nancy changed a code after submission, I did not call it anything more than that. I had no interest in making the evidence dramatic. I wanted it to survive, being questioned. Once everything was laid out chronologically, the pattern became easier to see. Most of Kayla's expenses were ordinary and fully supported. The problem was a smaller cluster tied to the weeks after she had joined the company. A storage payment, a moving-related charge, furniture that had been categorized as model home staging, a few miscellaneous expenses that looked personal until later codes made them appear connected to operations or community work. The original descriptions were vague. The later coding was cleaner. And in every case I had flagged, Nancy's administrator account appeared after the original submission. That still did not tell me whether Nancy had invented a business purpose or merely cleaned up sloppy paperwork after William approved something informally. I needed somebody outside the family dynamic to tell me what the records actually meant from a governance standpoint. I contacted the attorney Holloway Residential Group used for corporate matters. I was careful about how I framed the conversation. I did not ask him whether my mother had committed fraud. I did not ask him to represent me against my father. He represented the company, not me personally, and I understood that distinction. I need to know the proper company process, I told him. We have related party spending, post-submission coding changes, conflicting representations about my approval, and my banking administration access was suspended after I raised concerns. What should the company do to preserve records and review this without turning it into a family argument? He was quiet for a moment before answering. First, nobody should alter or destroy anything. Second, if the concern involves people inside existing administrative channels, you need an independent review of a defined scope. Third, if this touches succession or shareholder governance, it needs to be documented formally. That was exactly the kind of answer I needed, not vindication, procedure. He recommended that William and I agree on a third-party CPA firm that had not handled our daily bookkeeping. Dad resisted when I brought it up. His first reaction was that we already had accountants. I explained that our regular bookkeeping staff had worked with Nancy for years, which did not make them dishonest, but it made independence harder to defend. This doesn't need to be a forensic audit, I said. I'm not asking anyone to dig through 10 years of records. I want a targeted review. Kayla-related card activity, the coding changes, the approval trail, and any communication tied to those approvals. Dad looked exhausted. And if the review says nothing illegal happened, then we stop using the word illegal, which I haven't been using anyway. He looked at me for a long moment. Your mother says you already decided what happened. Mom knows what I decided because I told her too much too early, I'm not making that mistake again. That got his attention. By Wednesday afternoon, we had agreed on a regional CPA firm we had used once for a lender-related review, but that had never touched our daily expense processing. Dad signed off on the limited scope. I did too. Nancy called me less than an hour later. You brought outsiders into this company. No, Dad and I retained an independent CPA firm. For what? To prove your sister bought furniture? To determine which expenses were properly supported and which were not. You're humiliating your father. That isn't the scope of the review. You always do that. Do what? Hide behind procedures so you don't have to admit what you're really doing. I almost asked what she thought I was really doing. Instead, I remembered the call from the previous week and stopped myself. I'm not discussing the evidence with you before the review is complete. She went silent. Then she said, You really think you've become smarter than everybody else? No, I think I finally learned when not to explain myself. I ended the call.
Years old. If you've ever been called crazy for protecting the person you love most, Univest, drop a comment on October before Lily passed. What happened next? There was a charity day at everything they thought they owned. A donor lunch. The email your mother was there at 9:38. I recognized Thursday morning because you had mentioned her.
And reviewing the approval.
When I was in the break room at Prisma, I have something for Elizabeth. Halfway through a styrofoam box of bad coffee that evening. Still in scrubs from a 14-hour ICU shift. I asked her to describe the my fingernails. She said it was orange.
Preliminary summary across the table. He did not say fraud. He did not say embezzlement. He said, Several transactions appear to lack sufficient documentation for the current business classification. Some approvals are valid, but the descriptions available to the approver do not always match the final coded business purpose. We also confirmed multiple post-submission edits from the same administrative user. Dad looked at me. I said nothing. The CPA continued. That does not automatically mean the underlying expense was improper. It does mean the related party control process was weak, and the coding history needs explanation. That distinction mattered to me. I had been right to be concerned, but concern was not the same thing as a verdict. Then he turned to a second page. We also found an email in the document set that may be relevant to whether Miss Mercer was expected to know about these arrangements. My father reached for the page before I did.
That at night.
That overly formal tone she used when she wanted to sound above the chaos she often created, as though she were a school principal handing down a suspension, rather than a mother cutting out her own son from a family milestone. The room felt unusually quiet, as if the air itself had paused to see what he would do next. But Ethan didn't move. He didn't pace. He didn't write a furious email or call anyone. Instead, he opened a blank document on his laptop and typed
job, card, and related arrangements. There would have been nothing to hide from me until after Thanksgiving. Dad looked at the CPA. What exactly was attached to this email? A reimbursement, support packet, and administrative setup documents tied to Miss Grant. His face changed. For the first time since Thanksgiving, I saw something other than defensiveness. Uncertainty. Not about whether Nancy had been involved. About what she had told him. The corporate attorney spoke through the speakerphone.
Right away.
My father.
Ethan just sat there for a while, phone face down on the table, letting the silence in his apartment stretch as far as it needed to.
The
stillness wasn't uncomfortable. He was used to it. He had lived most of his life in that same quiet space emotionally. At least even when the rooms around him were full of people who shared his last name. That message from his dad was a ripple, but not yet a wave.
Finally,
not yet. Ethan had learned early that being quiet was easier than being.
I checked my phone. There was already a message from Nancy. You're going to regret turning this into a formal proceeding. I read it once and set the phone down. A week earlier, that message would have made me call her. Now I simply added the date and time to my notes. By Saturday morning, I understood that Nancy was not going to walk into Tuesday's meeting quietly. She could no longer control the records, so she started working on the people around them. My aunt called to ask why I was putting Dad through some kind of corporate hearing right before Christmas. A longtime supplier mentioned, carefully, that Nancy had told him there was tension over succession. Nothing she said was technically outrageous. That was what made it effective. She did not tell people I had stolen anything or threatened anyone. She simply presented herself as the mother watching her eldest daughter turn a Thanksgiving disagreement into a formal company dispute. I did not call relatives to defend myself. I did not post anything online. At work, I sent one short operational note to the managers who actually needed information. Leadership was reviewing an internal governance matter, ongoing projects were unaffected, and normal reporting lines remained in place. That was all. I had finally learned that trying to correct every version of Nancy's story only made me another person feeding it. The harder problem was sitting inside the CPA package on my desk. William had approved several of the expenses. Not all of them. Not every final category, but enough. The furniture purchase had a signed approval attached to an earlier description. The moving-related expense had a note from Dad allowing limited relocation support because Kayla's role required her to attend events in our area. A few restaurant charges had been approved as community development expenses. Nancy had not invented every transaction out of nothing. I read the approvals twice because I knew exactly what she would do with them Tuesday. William signed it, and she would be telling the truth. That forced me to narrow my argument even further. I could not say the spending was all unauthorized. I could say some charges had been recoded after submission. I could say my consent had been falsely represented. I could say information had been deliberately withheld from me. I could say Dad had been given an incomplete acquisition thread before he started making succession decisions. Those were facts. That distinction mattered more than winning an argument. Ryan found me Sunday afternoon at the dining room table, with the evidence spread into 6 small stacks. He picked up one of Dad's approvals and read it. So he did sign some of this. Yes. And you're still using it? Of course. He put the page down. Even though it makes your side messier, it makes the truth messier. That wasn't what I asked. I looked at him. Ryan pulled out the chair across from me. Are you willing to let your dad look bad, if that's what the records show? I hated how often he had been asking me questions I didn't want to answer. I'm not trying to make him look bad. I know. I'm asking whether you're still trying to stop him from looking bad. I looked down at the paperwork. William had hired Kayla. William had approved the card. William had signed some expenses. William had believed Nancy instead of asking me. Nancy had manipulated the information, but Dad had made choices inside that manipulation. If I removed those choices from the timeline to protect him, I would be doing exactly what Nancy had done with the acquisition email, selecting the pieces that created the story I preferred. No, I said finally. I'm not protecting him from his own signatures. Ryan nodded. Then you know what Tuesday is. It's not revenge. No, it's a record. That evening, I built the order I wanted to use in the meeting. I started with the simplest question. Did Nancy believe I knew about and approved Kayla's position? Then the card and expenses. Then the post-submission coding history. Then the email telling Dana not to send the setup documents to me until after Thanksgiving. Then the messages Nancy had sent Kayla and me. Last, the acquisition thread. The order mattered because I did not want to dump a pile of papers on the table and ask everyone to choose whom they loved more. I wanted each explanation to remain standing long enough to be compared with the next one. If Nancy said I had approved everything, then why
And
hide the
living alone in a modest
called
2-bedroom home
courses
on the
online
outskirts
and
of
asked
Portland,
for any
Oregon.
information about
He
all
worked
these
as a
really
systems
jobs.
analyst for a
If she
financial
said
firm,
representative
the kind of
was
job that
polite and moved
required
on.
precision,
Ma'am,
foresight,
I
and
understand.
a tolerance for
She said,
people
I
who
cannot
rarely
confirm or
understood
deny
what he
any
actually
why
did.
never seen my
He wasn't
refusal. I
flashy,
drove down to Greer
didn't
that
post
same
much on
afternoon.
social media,
I rang the bell
and had
at
long ago
5:15 on a
accepted that he
Wednesday.
wasn't the emotional
My father
centerpiece of
opened
his
the
family.
door. My mother stood
But what he
behind
lacked
me
in
with her arms
attention,
crossed.
he made up for in
Lily,
dependability.
not now.
That
Your mother
was.
is
Sunday night. Are you coming Tuesday? I don't know. You don't have to. She sounded surprised. Seriously? Yes. You need me there. I'd rather you be there. I don't need you there. There was silence. I continued. The messages speak for themselves. The records exist without you. If you come, it should be because you're willing to say what you were actually told, not because I pressured you. Kayla exhaled. Mom says you're trying to get her kicked out of the company. Mom doesn't own any of the company. You know what I mean. I know what she means. She said if I go into that meeting and take your side, I'm choosing you over her. There shouldn't be sides if all you're doing is telling the truth. That's easy for you to say. No, it isn't. She went quiet again. Then she said, if this blows up, Peyton and I may have to move sooner than I planned. I understood what she meant. Nancy was not just her mother. She was childcare, housing, emergency money, rides, meals, all the practical supports Kayla had gotten used to leaning on. You need to make whatever decision protects you and Peyton, I said. I'm not going to punish you for not becoming my witness. Kayla gave a humorless laugh. That almost makes it worse. Why? Because Mom keeps telling me you're trying to control everybody. I didn't answer. Monday morning, I had a meeting with the CPA representative and corporate counsel to confirm the documents they would be prepared to discuss. Counsel reminded all
I
of
drove
us that Tuesday was
105
not a
miles
trial.
south on
The goal was
I-26
to
in the dark,
establish what had happened,
and I walked into the
decide
surgical
what
wing
immediate
at
controls were
4:15 in the
necessary,
morning.
and determine
Granny
what
was
formal
out of
governance
recovery and
actions
in a
should follow.
step-down room with an
I was glad
IV
he
pump
said it
running
aloud.
morphine
I
at
did not want Dad later
1.5
claiming he
milligrams
had
an
been
hour,
ambushed into changing
and her hip
ownership
wrapped
or
in a
employment
brace
rights
from a
on the
partial
spot.
replacement
By
she had been
lunchtime,
arguing
Kayla
against
still had
for
not
2
answered.
years.
At
My mother was
3:20,
already
my
in the
phone
chair next to
vibrated.
the bed.
She had sent me a
She had a
screenshot.
folder open on her
It
lap.
was a message from Nancy from
Lily,
several weeks earlier.
perfect.
Sarah already approved everything. Don't bother her with details. Underneath the screenshot, Kayla wrote, I'll be there tomorrow. I'm not doing it to help you win. I need to hear Mom explain this while we're all in the same room. I saved the message with the rest of the records. That was enough. Not forgiveness. Not reconciliation. Just one person deciding she would no longer let somebody else speak for her. I was packing my laptop at the end of the day when Dad called. His voice sounded quieter than it had all week. Sarah, I need to ask you something before tomorrow. Okay, if this goes the way you think it will, and your mother really did what you're saying she did. He stopped. Then he asked the question I had been avoiding since Thanksgiving. Do you even still want this company? I looked through the glass wall of my office at the people finishing reports, answering calls, and checking project schedules. 11 years of my marriage had passed while I helped build a life outside this place. Nearly 15 years of my career had passed inside it. A week earlier, I would have answered immediately. That Monday, I couldn't. I'll tell you after the meeting, I said. Tuesday morning, the conference room felt smaller than it usually did. My father sat at the head of the table. I took the chair to his right. Nancy sat across from me with her hands folded so neatly that anyone walking in without context might have assumed she was the calmest person in the room. Kayla sat beside her, pale and stiff, with her company badge still clipped to her bag. At the far end were the corporate attorney and the representative from the CPA firm. There was no audience, no staff, no relatives waiting outside. That mattered to me. This was not a performance. It was a review of decisions that had been allowed to hide behind the word family. The attorney opened by stating what the meeting was and what it was not. It was not a court hearing. Nobody was there to decide criminal liability. William and I were the shareholders. Nancy and Kayla had been invited because the records directly involved them. The purpose was to establish what had been authorized, what had been communicated, and what governance changes were necessary. Any changes to banking permissions, company access, or formal policy would be documented afterward through the proper channels. Nancy leaned back. Good. Then maybe we can finally stop treating this like a prosecution. I looked at the notes in front of me. I'd like to start with one
Message
civil
made my
office
blood run
and
cold
sign a
from the
separate
one
document
person in the
that
family
nobody
who
in
never
court
gets
was going to
involved in
find out
drama.
about. Another
That's when I
night,
realized
Kayla's position before
this wasn't
Thanksgiving.
just about being
Nancy didn't answer
uninvited.
immediately.
They didn't
My
just
father
exclude me,
approved it.
they turned
See,
me
that
into the
wasn't my
villain.
mother's tape.
Behind my
Glanced at
back,
specimens.
they told the
I
whole
believe you. I
family
did
that
not
I
know what
refused
they
to
were. What does that
come,
mean?
that I was
I
bitter,
just knew this was
unstable,
evidence of a
jealous.
conspiracy.
In
They
April
even
of
told the groom's
2025,
family
Your
I
father
threatened
sent
to
me a
ruin
single
the wedding.
text
from her
But
car
they
They were
made
already
one
on
fatal
with the
mistake.
Greenville
Did I
Cancer
The wedding
upset her position?
contract, the venue,
Nancy's mouth
the flight.
tightened. Not in a formal meeting, no. Kayla shifted beside her. I moved to the next item. The CPA representative summarized the card activity. Several expenses were fully supported. A smaller group had documentation problems. Some had valid approval from Dad. That was important, and I said so before Nancy could. My father approved some of these charges. Nancy looked almost triumphant. Exactly. I turned to her. The issue is what he approved and how the charges were later coded. The CPA representative placed copies of the audit history report on the table. We confirmed that several transactions were edited after submission. The changes were made through an administrator account assigned to Miss Holloway. Nancy looked at the pages. I fixed sloppy coding. That's what I've been telling everyone. The CPA nodded. That may explain some changes. It does not explain why the edits were concentrated in a small group of related party expenses, or why the final business classifications were more specific than the original descriptions. Nancy folded her arms. Because I knew what William intended. Dad looked at her. Did I tell you to recode those? You told me to help Kayla. That is not the same question. For the first time that morning, Nancy looked irritated with him. I let the silence sit for a moment before moving on. I slid the email from Nancy to Dana across the table. Then explained this. Nancy read it. Even though I knew she had already seen it during the review, don't send this to Sarah yet. William wants to surprise her after Thanksgiving. She barely reacted. That was about the announcement. What announcement? Kayla joining the company. If I already knew and approved it, what exactly was being kept from me? You knew the idea. No, I didn't. Nancy looked toward Dad again. William knew. Dad said nothing. I continued. You told Dad I knew. You told Kayla I wanted her there. But you told the bookkeeper not to send me the setup documents until after Thanksgiving. Nancy sighed. Sarah, families do surprises. You're making that sentence sound sinister because you want it to. I opened the next file. Then let's look at what you told Kayla. Kayla's hands were in her lap now. I could see them clenched together. I read the message aloud. Sarah already approved everything. Don't bother her with details. Nancy looked at Kayla. You gave her that? Kayla finally spoke. You sent it to me. I'm asking why you gave it to her. Because it wasn't true. Nancy stared at her. We'll talk about this later. No, Kayla said. That's the problem. Everything is always later, when nobody else is there. The room went quiet. I looked down at my notes, not at Nancy. You also told me Kayla begged Dad for a job. Nancy said nothing. Kayla unlocked her phone and placed it on the table. And you told me Sarah thought I'd be perfect for community relations? Nancy's face changed slightly. Kayla scrolled to another message. You told Sarah I expected the company to pay for my move. You told me Dad insisted relocation should be covered. Nancy's voice sharpened. I was trying to keep everyone from fighting. You kept us from talking, Kayla said. There was a difference, and everyone in the room heard it. Nancy looked at Dad. Are you just going to sit there while they turn every conversation I've ever had into evidence against me? Dad's expression had gone hard. I'm waiting for an explanation. For what? For why they were told different things. Nancy threw up one hand. Because they are different people. You don't explain things the same way to everybody. That is not what happened, I said. You created consent where there wasn't any. Nancy laughed once. Consent? It was a job, Sarah, not surgery. The attorney shifted slightly, but did not interrupt. This was not his argument to make. I reached for the final document, the acquisition thread. Dad's expression changed before I even opened it. I placed the incomplete forward beside the full conversation from the shared executive mailbox. This is what Dad received. Nancy looked at it. This is what actually existed. Dad took the full thread and read my reply again. Thank you for reaching out. We are not considering a sale of the company. He looked at Nancy. Why didn't I see this? Nancy answered quickly. Because the point was that someone had approached her. The point, Dad said, was whether she was thinking about selling. I didn't know what she was thinking. You had the whole thread. Nancy's voice rose. And I knew Sarah. I knew how she was changing everything. I knew once you stepped back, she would formalize every relationship in this company until there was no family left in it. I said, so you showed him the part that frightened him. I showed him something he needed to know, and left out the part that would have corrected the fear. Nancy turned toward me. Because you don't understand what happens when one person gets too much control. I almost answered, but Dad spoke first. You mean Sarah? I mean anyone. Then why was Kayla the solution? Nancy hesitated. That was the first crack. I kept my voice level. If Dad had seen the full email and known I wasn't planning to leave or sell, what would have changed? Nothing. Then why leave it out? I just told you. No, you said you were worried about control. Nancy's eyes flashed.
She did not ask how I was.
Because you
She
already
said,
have everything.
Lily,
You have your shares.
you embarrassed
you
Mom
have
in
your
front of a
position,
hospital nurse.
You have your house.
She'll never
your
forgive
marriage.
you.
Your
Just
life.
stay away.
Kayla
It's
had
better for
nothing.
everyone.
Kayla looked at her.
I did not
Mom,
call my sister
Nancy kept
again for
going.
26
You were
months.
never going to give her room
In the
on your
summer
own.
of
The word
2024,
landed
Cassandra
before the rest of
texted
the
me from a
sentence
coffee
did.
shop
I
in Greer.
asked, room
Lily,
for what?
Granny
Nancy
moved
stared at
into
me.
Mom and Dad's
I
house
could
last
see her
week.
deciding whether to
They're
stop.
saying it's just
She
until she
didn't.
gets stronger.
If your father had
She's
known
not
We all
going
agreed
back
you're
to
not
Travelers
welcome.
he never would have made room for Kayla. Nobody moved. I thought about Isabella standing in that bedroom, looking at her drawings in a cardboard box. My father's face had gone completely still. Kayla whispered, "You mean in the company?" Nancy looked at her. "I mean in the family business." Kayla unclipped the badge from her bag. Nancy turned. "What are you doing?" Kayla placed the badge on the table, then pulled the corporate card from her wallet and set it beside it. "I'm done. Don't be ridiculous. I took the job because you told me Sarah wanted me there. She should have wanted you there. That isn't the same thing." Nancy's expression hardened. "After everything I've done for you?" Kayla looked down at the badge. "That's exactly why I need to leave." Dad leaned back in his chair. He looked older than he had 4 weeks earlier. Then he looked at Nancy. "You didn't protect this family." Nancy's face tightened. "You managed us." She opened her mouth, but he raised his hand. "No, I signed things I should have questioned. That part is mine. But you told me Sarah knew. You showed me part of an email. You told Kayla Sarah wanted her here. You told Sarah Kayla demanded help. You made sure none of us checked with each other." Nancy looked at me with something close to hatred. I didn't enjoy it. The attorney stepped in then and brought the meeting back to process. The agreed immediate actions were straightforward. Nancy's remaining business permissions would be revoked through the proper administrative and banking procedures. The targeted financial review would continue until the questionable expenses were classified properly. Any personal or unsupported amounts would be handled based on the final findings. The succession process would pause until the governance structure was rewritten. Dad listened, then looked at me. "If we fix this," he said, "will you still take over?" I thought about the question he had asked me the night before. This time I knew the answer. Not under the old rules. He waited. "I'll put my conditions in writing. If you agree, we can discuss what succession looks like. If you don't, I'll leave the operational role." Nancy gave a bitter laugh. There it is, the ultimatum. I looked at her. "No, an ultimatum is when I tell Dad what he has to do. I'm telling him what I'm willing to participate in." Then I turned back to my father. "And if I leave operations, my 35% doesn't disappear because anyone is angry. Whatever happens next happens under the shareholder agreement, not at this table." Dad nodded slowly. For the first time since Thanksgiving, nobody asked Nancy what I meant. Nobody needed her to explain me anymore. The morning after the meeting, I wrote down my conditions before anyone had time to reinterpret them. I did not send Dad an angry message or demand more shares. I drafted a formal governance proposal and sent it to him, the corporate attorney, and the outside CPA. I wanted an outside controller or accounting oversight process, dual approval for related party expenses and corporate cards, written family employment rules, documented job descriptions, market rate compensation, no new administrative access without formal authorization, and a written succession plan. I also wanted an independent valuation process for any future transfer of ownership. My 35% was not a bargaining chip, and I was not going to accept more equity as an apology for bad governance. I told Dad plainly that if he wanted me to continue in an operational leadership role, those changes had to become part of how the company functioned. If he refused, I was prepared to step away from operations and let the shareholder agreement govern whatever happened next. He called me less than an hour later. His voice was tired but not defensive. "You really meant what you said yesterday?" "Yes. You'd walk away from the job if the old system stays in place, and keep your shares. They're mine." There was a long pause. Then he said, "I know." That mattered more than an apology would have at that point. For most of the month, every disagreement had eventually been translated into family language. Loyalty, gratitude, tradition. What I needed from Dad was for him to stop treating ownership, authority, and affection as if they were the same thing. He asked for a day to review the proposal with counsel. I told him to take it. By Friday, he had agreed to the major changes.
Friday, and I would finally learn what she had been waiting all this time in the street. If you've ever read a message from someone my father was supposed to love you and felt your whole spine turning into strangers, I put the sketch face up on the table. You'll want to be here for what they didn't know they had written. This was given to Mom, who understands why my grandmother shared sapphire ring by Sophia Donovan at the Boston Children's Donor Appreciation Luncheon. Singer's sewing machine. It was in the hands of a paralegal. Mom kept it in her dresser drawer. You have to understand from the what kind of woman she was.
Silk scarves needed to go through formal channels. There was no announcement saying Nancy had been disgraced. There did not need to be. The effect was immediate anyway. For years, people had called my mother because it was easier. She knew Dad's schedule. She knew who had his ear. She knew which vendor had been around the longest and which employee was afraid to push back. Her power had never come from a title. It came from being the person everyone thought they had to go through. Now, they didn't. The targeted review continued through the following weeks. As expected, not every expense was improper. Several had legitimate business purposes and enough documentation to support them. Some did not. A handful of charges connected to Kayla's move and personal needs could not be supported as business expenses under the categories they had eventually been given. Those amounts were separated, documented, and repaid under a practical schedule. No one was arrested. No one was marched out in handcuffs. The consequences were less theatrical than that, and far more believable. Kayla formally resigned from the community relations position. I offered her no replacement job. That surprised her. We were sitting in a coffee shop when she said, "I thought you might ask me to stay." With a real job description this time. "Do you want to stay?" She looked down at her cup. "I don't know. That's why I'm not asking." She smiled faintly. "You always make everything sound simple. It isn't simple. But if you stay because I offer you something after Mom offered you something, you still don't know whether you chose it." She nodded slowly. Kayla eventually found a position outside the family company. It wasn't glamorous, and she didn't suddenly become completely independent overnight. She still had to figure out childcare, housing, and money in ways she had avoided before. But for the first time, those decisions belonged to her. I respected that more than I would have respected her staying at Holloway, just because I wanted to prove I was more generous than our mother. Dad also had consequences. He did not retire the next day, and I did not take over the company in some symbolic ceremony. He followed the timeline he had already been considering, and began stepping back from daily management. The difference was that the succession process was no longer something he could discuss through Nancy or improvise over dinner. It was written down, reviewed, valued, documented. A few weeks after the meeting, he came into my office and closed the door. "I should have asked you about the acquisition email." "Yes." "I should have asked you about Kayla." "Yes." He almost smiled. "You're not making this easy." "I'm not trying to make it hard." He nodded. "That may be worse." I knew what he meant. He wanted forgiveness to feel like relief. I was not ready to give him relief on command. I was willing to rebuild trust, but I needed his behavior to do more work than his guilt. Nancy reacted differently. The first time she realized her old login no longer worked, she called me. "You erased me." "No, I can't access anything." That was the point. After everything I did for that company, "You don't work there. I helped build it. You helped Dad when the company was smaller. That does not mean permanent authority." Her voice went cold. "So this is your revenge?" "No, this is what it looks like when access matches responsibility. You're enjoying this." I wasn't. That was the strange part. For weeks, I had imagined that if I ever proved what she had done, I would feel something sharp and satisfying. Instead, I mostly felt tired. I had wanted a mother I could trust. Removing permissions from a company system was not a replacement for that. A week later, Nancy called again and asked whether Isabella could have her room back. I almost said yes out of habit. Then I remembered Isabella standing in that doorway, looking at her things in a cardboard box. "No." Nancy was silent. "You said she was hurt because I gave it to Peyton." "She was. So I'm fixing it." "You're trying to reset the room. That doesn't reset what happened." "What do you want me to do, Sarah?" "I want you to stop using a bedroom to decide who belongs more." That weekend, Ryan and I went with Isabella to collect the rest of her things. Nancy had put the room mostly back the way it had been.
every
lamp was on the
email she had
nightstand
ever
again.
sent all this time the same way.
drawings
I
had been
thought you had
repainted.
Lily.
The books
Your
were
father
stayed
stayed on
on
my phone with her about
Isabella
45
stood in the
minutes.
doorway and looked
We're
around.
prepared to give back what your grandmother left for you. I told her about the Yale
only
committee,
after you come to the
about
house.
Juliet's
My daughter
essay,
looked
face
at
us
me.
in person, about the
I
letter
said,
Marlowe
and
had
apologized.
on
You get
video.
to decide what
3
you want to
months.
take
She
home.
listened without.
She
That was
picked
how
up the
long my
lamp
grandmother
first.
had been
At
in the
the
ground,
end,
she said.
then
I
the
scrolled.
frame
What do you need me to
drawings.
do?
By the
41
time we
bullet
left,
points. I told her I
the
would
room
call her
looked
back. I
less
read
like
them once
Isabella's.
the way
There
you
was
read
something
aloud.
I
I
had
had
to
to
do
do
for
for
her
patient. You don't
against
know
the
yet.
evening
Someone
of
else's
March
house.
house. In the car, she asked, "Does that mean I don't have a room at Grandma's anymore? You have a home with us. I know. And you don't need a room somewhere else to prove people love you there." She thought about that for a while before nodding. By late January, the biggest change in my family was not the company policy or the money Kayla had to repay. It was communication. Dad called me directly. Kayla called me directly. If Peyton wanted to come over, Kayla asked me instead of Nancy telling one of us what the other had supposedly agreed to. If Dad had a question about succession, he asked me. If I disagreed with him, I said so to him. The phrases, "Mom said you said," and "Nancy told me you wanted," slowly disappeared. One Sunday afternoon, we had a small family meal at my house. Nancy came. So did Dad, Kayla, Peyton, and Isabella. I did not make it a reconciliation ceremony. I did not ask anyone to give a speech. When we sat down, Nancy pointed toward 2 chairs and said, "Peyton should sit there, Isabella can move over." The old version of me might have ignored it because the seating arrangement was meaningless. Instead, I looked at the girls. They had already dragged their chairs together on the other side of the table. "They already decided," I said. Nancy opened her mouth. Then she closed it. Nobody rearranged themselves for her. Nobody argued either. That was the part I remembered most later. For years, I had been proud of being the person who could handle more, need less, and give up ground without making anyone uncomfortable. I had confused resilience with obligation. I did not want Isabella learning the same lesson. Being able to handle something does not mean you should have to accept it, and boundaries are not punishments. They are simply the rules for being in my life. You should never confuse being capable with being obligated to accept unfair treatment. When family uses your strength as an excuse to take your time, money, position, or dignity, the right response is not sacrifice. It is a clear boundary backed by facts and consistent action. You can love people without giving them control over your life, and you can forgive without restoring access they abused. Protect your children from learning that keeping the peace means staying silent when something is wrong. If this story gave you something to remember, subscribe to the channel for more family stories and hard-earned lessons.